Our next speaker is William Turner. He's the Director of the Division of Emergency Management, Homeland Security. We're located in Middletown at the State Police Headquarters. Go ahead, Director, sir.
Thank you, Doug, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for the town of Darien for hosting us. It's a beautiful facility. I've never been in here. It's a really neat place. I'm sorry if I'm looking around at the ceiling and the walls, but the artwork's pretty impressive. But I thank you all for coming out tonight. I know it's a muggy, nice spring evening here in Connecticut, but taking the time now before we get into our hurricane season is important, and what you're going to hear tonight is from a range of experts from the Army Corps of Engineers, the Weather Service, really to help you better understand products and resources that are available to you to help you prepare and understand what your risks are and how you can make informed decisions if you find yourself in a situation where maybe severe weather is coming your way. As we talk about coastal communities, and I know here we are in a coastal community, I'd be remiss not to say that we're also really focusing on this effort statewide. What we saw last year with Helene, we understand that hurricanes don't just impact coastal communities. That was well inland when it impacted North Carolina. The risk associated with even severe weather, while we're focused on hurricanes tonight, things that you can do now to take actions you can take, little things that you can do that you're going to learn about tonight and resources are really going to help you and your families be better prepared for when you find yourself potentially in the paths of these destructive storms. So I'm really excited to have this partnership with the Army Corps and all the partners involved tonight. We did a separate series of workshops last year where we went and talked to town officials around risk associated with flooding, and now we want to really take it out to the public and make sure that we spend time talking to you and letting you know what's out there and available to you. And I also want to say that, while I don't want to say end on a somber note, I think it's important to just mention that because of what we experienced here in Connecticut, primarily in New Haven County, but also a little bit of Fairfield and Litchfield counties with the August flooding. Unfortunately, we lost 3 lives as a result of that incident, and that wasn't forecast. That really was a no-notice event. We knew it was going to rain, but not to that magnitude, and that was a result of flash flooding and inland, well away from the coast. And that was a truly catastrophic event that resulted in a major disaster declaration. And why I want to bring that up is because, if anything, what I've really been trying to emphasize as I go out and talk to the public is please go home and check what your insurance policies are, because so many people that we talked to that had damages as a result of that flooding, we found out, we heard it time and time again, that they didn't have flood insurance because they're not in a floodplain. And we're seeing more and more often where people are having flood damages to their property and they don't have that flood insurance because homeowners insurance covers a lot of things, but often flooding is a separate rider or policy on your insurance. So please take the time now, review your policies, even if you're outside that floodplain. Do what you can do to understand your risk. And even not just saying this because of the climate with the current state of FEMA, I don't know what the future holds with them, but I also like to emphasize, while FEMA is a great partner of ours, the reality is that they're not going to come in and make you whole. Average payouts after some of these big storms are only in the $4,000 to $6,000 range. If you've lost everything, that's not going to make you whole. So it might be more in severe cases, but in a lot of in our flooding event, using Southbury as the example, the average payout was $4,400 from FEMA. So please just do what you can. Again, I'm not trying to be what I often call Doug as doom and gloom, but I think when we say hurricanes mean business, but we also mean we're in the business of preparedness and helping you. So we want you to take this seriously and protect your investments, your property, your family. Do what you can today. Learn something tonight. Take it home. It doesn't need to be a 300-page plan that you develop with your family. It could just be sitting around the dinner table and having a conversation about what are we going to do if we have to evacuate, or what are we going to do if our basement starts filling up with water and things like that. So thank you for coming tonight, and I really appreciate you being here and taking the time to make sure you're all prepared, and I hope you enjoy the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Okay, so the program that funds these workshops is known as Silver Jackets. And Silver Jackets has been around for a while. Most people associate the Army Corps of Engineers with the big dams and, the big structural projects that occur, around the United States. They're very familiar with that. But they also have what I call the softer side, which is Silver Jackets. And it's a big planning initiative, a very nice program. And I'm going to have Sheila Warren from the Army Corps of Engineers come up and talk about Silver Jackets. And I'll load your presentation for you here. Okay.
Thank you. Which button am I pushing, Doug?
It's the left-hand clicker right here to advance the slide.
This guy?
Yep.
Hi, okay. Hi, everybody. My name's Sheila Warren. I'm from the Army Corps of Engineers, New England District, which is in Concord, Massachusetts. New England District covers Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. And as Doug said, many of the residents are aware of the Corps because of our dams and some reservoirs and recreation that occurs on the areas behind our dams. Other people know us because there's a regulatory side of the Corps that helps apply permits and permitting when you want to do work in the water. And like Doug said, the part of the Corps that I work for is what's called Floodplain Management Services Program. And that's a program that's technical assistance, allowing the states that ask for the help to bring in experts like me and Meg in terms of doing technical assistance, explaining floodplains, explaining how the floodplain management works, how to deal with flood risk, helping the public figure out their risk and what to do about it. So that's what my program is. The Silver Jackets program is a portion of the Floodplain Management Services program, which is a team that's in each state. And so, like I said, 6 states have Silver Jackets teams. And Doug is the team chair here in Connecticut, run by Department of Environmental Emergency Management and Homeland Security, seconded by DEEP's National Flood Insurance Program, Diane Iflick, who is the NFIP coordinator. So those are federal programs that we support. The Corps brings in federal agencies to assist with the flooding, and the state brings the state agencies that deal with flooding, and together we all get we network, we talk to each other, we figure out each other's programs where we can provide assistance when something happens. And also now in this case, we're showing you, the public, what kind of resources are out there. And one of them that the Silver Jackets team in Connecticut did was this flood toolkit. So what this is a web page where you can identify what to do before a flood, what to do during the flood, what to do immediately after the flood, and then how to plan for the next flood. And the whole purpose of this is to let people know floods aren't going to stop. They've been New England's been flooding since the settlers, actually before any settlers came here. This is nothing new. As Doug said, we're in a drought a little bit for the big storms, but the flooding situation it's just the environment that we live in here in New England. And this kind of a tool can really put you in place with what the state resources are, where the National Weather Service resources are, other kinds of resources, and also from the Corps, the U.S. Geological Survey, all types of other types of people that deal with flooding, and FEMA, of course, FEMA. So another thing, as Mr. Turner just said, we also have been doing these workshops. So a couple of years ago, we did them a lot for the emergency management community and the fire chiefs and the police chiefs, so they can actually help with the communities. And now we're bringing this kind of program to the public. We're glad you're here. As they've said a couple times, everybody's responsible. If you expect the government to come, yes, we'll be glad to come, but if you do some small things, you will not have as much risk of flooding. You can limit that risk. You can be more resilient. You can recover faster. And so this is what this program's all about. And you'll learn a little bit from each one of the experts. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Oh, yeah. Yes.
Could you have a website, a contact? I know that you have handouts, but
Yes.
I'm not going to start looking through my handouts.
Oh, yes. This flood toolkit is available at www.ct.gov DEMHS. That's our website, and I think you can search it in Google. If you search flood toolkit, I think it'll come up too. So, and by the way, we will be sending out copies of these presentations to all the attendees tomorrow morning. So everything you see tonight, you'll get a copy of in your email tomorrow morning.
And if you search flood toolkit, you might find New Hampshire's, because New Hampshire built a flood toolkit similar to the Silver Jackets team did this about 5 years ago. This one's about 3 years old instead. So you might find New Hampshire's flood toolkit also.
Is your address on there?
The Corps is not. It's all of your Silver Jackets.
Yes, it's Silver Jackets for Connecticut, so each state has one. Yeah.
Oh, on the slide, you're correct. And we will, when you, I'll fix that when.
Yeah, if you have a business card, we can reach out directly to you,
I'll fix the
walk you
slide
through.
so it has my name in it.
Oh, okay, yep, definitely. Okay. What's that? Oh, Demis, so it's a / this way, and then DEM, yeah, DEMHS. Yep. All right, so what do we do when the hurricane's rolling up the coast and it's threatening the state? So the office that handles your forecasts in this area is located in Brookhaven, Long Island. They're the National Weather Service office that handles the forecasting for all of southern Connecticut, all 4 southern counties, Fairfield, New Haven, Middlesex, and New London counties. So we have Nelson Vaz on here today. He's a warning coordination meteorologist from that office, and he's going to talk about the tools that they have for forecasting hurricanes, the impacts from those hurricanes, and all things hurricanes and flooding. Again, flooding is the #1 killer in a hurricane. So I know everybody pays attention to the wind speed on the Saffir-Simpson scale. They talk about category 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's really the storm surge that's the killer in a hurricane. So I'm going to turn it over to Nelson here, and go ahead and take it away, sir.
Thank you very much, Doug. And hopefully you guys are seeing and hearing me. I may turn off my camera once I start getting into the presentation, just because I know there's been a little bit of lag. But just want to give a thanks to First Selectman and Town of Darien for hosting this, for our partners, longtime partners at Connecticut Demis. Doug has been a partner since I got here 22 years ago. Director Turner, since he got here, an excellent relationship. And, the whole relationship is for us as the federal government authority who's responsible for weather observations, weather warnings, weather forecasts, to inform the public, to warn the public of impending events and what we're going to be discussing today about hurricanes, and especially the storm surge component of hurricanes, the water threats and hazards. I'll provide an overview, but it's really this partnership that we have, and with our other governmental partners who you'll hear from, experts, working together to provide really actionable information, to provide that education, that outreach before the storm, to allow to allow not only you to take the best action personally, but also for our public safety officials to take the best protective actions for our communities to protect lives and property. So appreciate them hosting this, for us, for my invite to speak, and also for you all to come and to learn. I think this is a great opportunity, and I think it takes a community with the public safety officials as a whole to really kind of build this weather-ready nation. So thank you for coming and joining in today. So let me share my screen. I will be turning off my camera just to prevent any kind of lag that we might get. I'll turn it back on at the end. But hopefully you are seeing my screen, and you see the whole thing here, preparedness talent. And I think that's kind of what Doug mentioned. First Selectman mentioned, that's what Director Turner mentioned, is that this is in terms of hurricanes, really this is the most potent type of event that we can get in our area, and in terms of the amount of damage it can cause, and also the loss of life. You're talking about deadly flooding, whether it be from storm surge and heavy rain, but also destructive winds, all combined in one intense storm. And it is really a preparedness challenge for us, because we don't see these very often. As Doug talked about, 40 years since our last landfalling hurricane. So you got to go back to Hurricane Gloria. You're talking about, I was 10 years old, 1985. I'm almost turning 50 here. So you think of a lot of younger generation where they're not going to remember. You have a whole generation that has never had any experience with a landfalling hurricane. And then some of the major hurricanes that Doug talked about. You got 1954 Carol. We'll touch on a few of these. Really a benchmark storm, 1938 hurricane. These are really devastating, life-changing types of storms, major hurricanes where you have 110-mile-per-hour winds, but also with that really destructive storm surge and also the rainfall on top. So we don't have a lot of experience with it. The other thing is we don't even need a hurricane, a full-fledged hurricane, as we know, to have issues here. Director Turner talked about the flooding we saw from not even a tropical event, the flash flooding last August that caused, unfortunately, loss of life. But we had Ida, which was the remnants of a hurricane, which once was a Category 3 hurricane, weakened, made its way up into our area, and brought devastating flash flooding to the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut tri-state area. So we don't even need a hurricane, and that's why it's important to plan, as Director Turner was, to have a plan to prepare every year, because we don't know when. It's not a question of if it's going to happen; it's a question of when. But we don't know which year it's going to happen, so we need to prepare this period of time every year. Because we are an inexperienced population. And then the other thing is we also have, you think about, since 1985, or even if you experienced Bob, which really kind of affected far eastern areas in 1991, 35 to 40 years ago, since we've had any experience with a hurricane, you think of how much has changed since then. The advent, the reliance we have on electricity, the internet, computer technology, cellular technology, all of which can be very susceptible to a hurricane, especially whether it be wind and water damage. So these are things that we take for granted, in our everyday lives, and these could be severely and kind of for a long duration be affected if we do. Or when we do get affected by a hurricane, and especially a major hurricane. And we think about all the buildup we have along the coastline. When we talk specifically about storm surge, along the coastline, a lot of buildup of population as well as infrastructure, and really critical infrastructure. This kind of map here just shows in these darker shades where are the areas that are highly, very highly developed. And you can, of course, see Bridgeport, and then, kind of going down the coast, some of our major city centers. And then you can also kind of see I-95 here along the coast. Now, if I overlay that with what the potential is, say we have a major hurricane, what kind of storm surge could that bring? So that storm surge is water above ground. And this is actually kind of a simulation, reasonable kind of worst case scenario for a major hurricane, a Category 3 hurricane. It's based on running a slosh model. Megan from U.S. Army Corps will talk more about it. But basically, it's one of the tools, skillful storm surge models we use, that you can run a lot of simulations of various Category 3 hurricanes, different sizes, different speed of approach, different angle of approach, and basically composite over an area. What's the worst case storm surge scenario you can get? And this is what the potential could be. You can see, areas in the red, and orange, 6 to greater than 9 feet of water above ground over all these highly developed population areas. Of course, you have areas like Bridgeport, actually the airport there. Several areas that are going all the way from the coast well up to I-95. So just in terms of the thought of this may not be the footprint of what would occur, everywhere that you would see this amount of water, but large areas of the area could see this if you have the kind of the worst case in terms of a storm track. And then same thing, if we look at population density, you see a lot of areas in terms of population density. Again, some of our urban centers, and again, you overlay what could occur in terms of reasonable worst case with a Category 3, a major hurricane storm surge scenario. So we're talking about potential for a lot of damage to infrastructure, and a lot of vulnerability because of the high population infrastructure we have. And then the consequences, if we don't take protective actions, would be, when you're talking about 6 to 9 feet of inundation, would be potentially loss of life. So, and I think that's really kind of part of what we work together with our public safety officials, with our governmental partners that you'll hear from today, is making sure we can get the best information to our decision makers and the public to take personal action, but also to take that community action and protective actions. Really, we're not going to be able to prevent all the damage. unfortunately, when you're talking about these higher end events, there's a lot of mitigation efforts going on. So that will certainly help to limit for some areas the damage, but in some areas, when we have a major hurricane, it's very tough to limit or to avoid that damage. But what we want to do is get people out of harm's way. And just to kind of give a little bit of a note, say a major hurricane does hit our area, it's very plausible you can have water that gets 10 feet above your typical high tide. How many people live below that level? Almost 47,000 people live below that kind of water line that would be potentially inundated with life-threatening flooding. Almost 20,000 homes. 13 billion in property, 226 miles of roads, 6 miles of railroads. So a lot of infrastructure and collateral damage that could occur. And then, so again, what's our main goal is to get people out of harm's way before with the best weather information and the best actionable information for our public safety officials to take those life-saving preparedness and response actions. So in terms of fatalities, I think Doug had mentioned this, water is the #1 cause. So whether you look back 1963 to 2012, and I'll tell you why we separated this, to 2013 to 2023, water is 90% of the fatalities from tropical cyclones is due to water. If you go back to 1963 to 2012, of that, 90% of the fatalities, but of all those fatalities, half of them were from storm surge. And you can think of storms like during that time period. You can think of Camille, Katrina, Sandy. These were unfortunately very devastating in terms of storm surge, a lot of loss of life. But what's happened since then, especially since Katrina and Sandy, is we have a lot better in terms of being able to forecast water levels and storm surge, a lot better ability, and especially the communication, the tools that we have, the messaging that we have, inundation mapping, impact catalogs, ways to visualize what potentially we could see in terms of storm surge, a reasonable worst case. And what that does is help our decision makers to get people out of harm's way, into shelters, into evacuating from those areas that potentially could flood, in terms of constructing hurricane evacuation zones, all based on this type of modeling skill and the ability to visualize this, and also to help you, as the public, to really understand if it's something that you haven't experienced, what this 10, 15 feet of water could mean. Could it affect your community? Could it affect your house? So with that, we still are seeing 90% of the fatalities 2013 to 2023, so kind of modern time. But now storm surge is a lot smaller. It's only 11% of the fatalities, so real improvements in the forecasting, the visualization of the message. But, we still do see a lot of the fatalities due to rainfall. So the positive is that because of these improvements has decreased being able to get people out of the way of storm surge. But rainfall is a tough one because, with rainfall, storm surge, if you can get people away from the coast, maybe riverine areas, low-lying areas, you can get them out of harm's way. Rainfall, really anywhere you live, you can be affected. If you get a heavy enough rainfall over a short enough period of time, it can flood. You live in low-lying area, basements, in urban areas, of course, near riverine areas, and a lot of, what we have in Connecticut, we have a lot of rivers, we have urban areas, we have topography. Those are all things that, unfortunately, exacerbate rainfall, and it's very tough, as Director Turner mentioned. It's not a perfect science in terms of being able to tell exactly where the heaviest rain is going to be, what the rainfall rates, how long those rainfall rates are going to last over an area, and then you're dealing with things. How is the response going to be in terms of runoff, in terms of the storm drainage being able to drain an area, things like that, permeability of the soil. The response of the rivers. So that all makes it very difficult. So we're not at the same stage as we are with storm surge to be able to tell you exactly how high the water is going to get in your area due to rainfall. But just to kind of give you a note is just there have been some improvements, but water still remains #1 in terms of the killer, in terms of tropical cyclones. And that's where we're providing the best type of information to be able to get at least people, recognizing are they in an area that is susceptible, and at least making kind of educated decisions to get you to safety, or take the the approach of least regret before an event. The other thing is it's not even during the tropical systems. It's sometimes after the tropical systems we've seen a lot of fatalities. Actually going from 2017 to 2021, we saw more fatalities post-event unfortunately from things like cleanup, where it could have been electrocutions, could be heart attacks, carbon monoxide poison, because you lose power. It could be you're talking about warm season, and you're trying to use generators to keep your refrigerator going, you may be air conditioning, but improperly using that, and carbon monoxide poisoning, as well as just succumbing to the heat if you don't have that ability to get into a cooling area or have a generator. And then especially if you're kind of vulnerable populations coming to the heat. So these are all things that, I think having that knowledge of what potentially can happen and being able to prepare ahead of time, and from a public safety official, I think we can, some of these are preventable, certainly. Now, kind of to focus on the storm surge aspect, why is storm surge such a problem in our area? And a big part of it is storm surge, and that coastal flooding we see, it's based on the winds. It's really the driver is the winds. How strong are the winds? How much of an area are those winds blowing off the ocean, the sound, and pushing it, that water towards the area? We call it like how long is the fetch? So how much wind is blowing over how much area of water, the duration of that. All that is going to kind of be the players in terms of how much water gets, piled up towards the coast. And especially for our area, if I had a zoomed out image, you kind of think about the eastern coast of Long Island. A lot of it's kind of north to south, northeast to southwest aligned. But then we kind of jet out there with Long Island and then the Connecticut coast, right, Rhode Island, southeastern Mass. So you think of a storm that's rotating, very strong winds over a large area, maybe coming up from the southeastern United States, the Caribbean, the Atlantic. It's generating these waves and that large area of wind field that's going to be piling that water, pushing that water. And if that storm approaches the coast and kind of makes landfall in our area, all that water that's been built up, that wave action that's actually building that water level as well, there's nowhere to go except on top of the land. So that's what makes for our area, very susceptible to these type of systems for storm surge, and also just naturally because these hurricanes or even tropical storms can have these long duration, strong wind fields that are going to develop this type of storm surge. The other thing is wave action. Unlike like say Long Island, where there is some protection from the dunes and the beachfront, to at least protection to the mainland from those dunes and beach protection from the wave action from the ocean. We can generate pretty good wave action in Long Island Sound, and there is no really kind of like dune front that helps protect the Connecticut coastline. We've seen it during storm force, so even during winter storms, or even during higher end tropical storm, the Isaias tropical storm, where we saw kind of mid-range tropical storm force winds. We can easily see 5 to 7 foot waves that are breaking onto the shoreline. And then based on some of the research by Dr. O'Donnell at UConn, it's possible that we could even see 10, 15 foot waves in really kind of extreme cases. So that's that wave action on top of those elevated water level, that storm surge, that's going to create even more damaging impacts in these high end events. And then of course you get water that's being forced onto the coast, that storm surge. It also gets forced upriver, right? But at the same time, if you have heavy rains, that potentially could be increasing the stream flows and then draining into the rivers, and you have topography that's kind of all draining into these streams, trying to go back out to the sound, and then you have storm surge pushing up. That's just going to exacerbate things. So all those things are kind of challenges, and really important to know if you live in a flood zone and what you're going to do if we have this type of event that could bring storm surge or riverine flooding to the area. Just to kind of note, looking at some historical water levels in the Bridgeport area. This is the one water level sensor that we have in Southwest Connecticut. It doesn't go back that far in time, but you can see the two highest water levels that have been reached. We have Irene in 2011, where it had almost 5 feet above the high tide, typical high tide line, and Sandy almost 6 feet above. So, a lot of then below that, you of course get a lot of coastal storms in the wintertime, a lot of these, lesser events, but some of the peak ones are these tropical systems. And if we did have the center back here, say for the 1938 hurricane, I think we could probably have seen the water levels even higher. If you go into parts of western Long Island Sound, the Kings Point, Willets Point area in western Long Island, their highest water level was still from the 1938 hurricane, so higher than what was occurred in Sandy. But where Sandy is useful is because Sandy is, at least some recent memory for us and an understanding that storm surge can really bring, deadly impacts to our area. And in this case, Sandy, kind of look in the upper left here, what was a hurricane that actually, it was what we call post-tropical hurricane, which it kind of a tropical hurricane that became, impacted or affected by kind of our mid-latitude weather patterns up here. But in any case, it made landfall as a post-tropical hurricane in southern Jersey, but it didn't actually bring hurricane force sustained winds to our area, but it brought in high-end tropical storm force winds. We were talking about 60 to 70 mile per hour sustained winds, gusts 80 to 90 miles per hour, but over a very large area that forced a lot of water, that counterclockwise circulation. You can imagine around a large area around this hurricane. As that hurricane made landfall into southern Jersey, it forced a lot of water into, you can see here better, this funnel that we have kind of in Long Island Sound and this part of our New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area. What it caused was 3 to 6 feet of water above ground as that storm came in across the southwestern Connecticut coast, as much as 5 to 8 feet across the New York City metro, but 77 fatalities from this. Most of them occurred in the New York City, New Jersey metro area, but we had even outside of that. And when you're talking about anything over 3-4 feet of water, along with wave action, certainly that can be deadly and destructive, and that's where it becomes imperative to get people out of harm's way. Just some of the pictures in terms of Greenwich, Fairfield, hard hit, and the Bridgeport area. Just some reminders of what kind of higher end storm surge can do. Some of the pictures out of Fairfield, Connecticut, right along the coast, and you can kind of imagine, during the height of the storm, the elevated water levels plus the wave action forcing water in. And even Bridgeport Airport does not flood very often, but did, I think you had to go back probably to the 1992 nor'easter, but it flooded during Sandy here. And so you can kind of think, although, you think about this, as devastating as it was, it's not necessarily a worst case scenario. Again, like we were talking about, if we go back to 1954, that was the last major hurricane. So if you're talking about a major hurricane, you're talking about something that may have 110 mile per hour sustained winds, higher gusts. So think of the even more force that's pushing water towards the coast. Hurricane Carol, you can see kind of the track. It paralleled the coast, made landfall in southeastern Connecticut, 10 to 15 feet of water above the normal astronomical tide, which resulted in 6 to as much as 12 feet of water above ground. So you're talking almost double what occurred with Sandy, with the wave action. But fortunately, at least for western parts of Connecticut, it did occur further east. These are some of the pictures out of Groton, kind of Long Point, but you can think of shoreline areas, how that water would be forced in with the wave action, doing a tremendous amount of damage to our areas that are right along the coast here. And you can see, especially, far southeastern Connecticut, Rhode Island, saw tremendous impacts. Again, really the kind of the storm of note, the 1938 hurricane, you can see the track here. What was interesting, it was not as pronounced. Most of the hurricanes, many of the hurricanes, tropical storms we see, they tend to parallel the coast. And in a way that's good, because sometimes, where you do see the strongest winds, you think of a storm coming up, the counterclockwise winds, it's going to be on that eastern side, that northeastern side of that storm, where you can have the strongest winds that are going to be, perpendicular to the coast and forcing water in the same direction as the movement of the storm. Sandy took a really hard left turn, which kind of really maximized that storm surge towards our coastline. This one, interestingly, took a little bit of a turn like that, not as extreme. But when you're talking about this storm was moving at 50 miles per hour, had winds 110 mile per hour, gusts up to 150 miles per hour. So that combined forward speed with that strength of the storm, brought water, inundation as much as 10 to 15 feet above ground level, especially areas east of where it made landfall. So it made landfall around, kind of central Long Island, up near New Haven. The worst was across southeastern Connecticut again, but think of this, if this storm had made a little more, it was a little further west, we could have been talking even more inundation, even to, western Connecticut. The other thing that was really interesting with this is it moved through so quickly that, areas along where we are, western Long Island Sound, they experienced their main water levels, or the highest water levels, occurred well after the passage of the storm, because the storm was actually moving quicker than the water could kind of funnel around into the sound, but still produce some of the highest water levels recorded out in kind of the far western part of Long Island Sound, even though it wasn't the worst case trajectory. Some of the pictures from this, but kind of think back to that map I showed you, areas 6 to 9 feet of water, getting up to places on I-95. Again, most of the damage occurred here, or the worst damage occurred over southeastern Connecticut, but a further west track could do the same along the whole coastline. So you can see some of the impacts. I talk about, deep water wave action up to I-95, but in this case also affecting the railways along most of the Connecticut coast. This is an example from Westbrook, Connecticut, just how, that wave action, elevated water levels kind of really scoured anything that was, kind of closer on the coastal plain. More examples from Guilford, Connecticut, and then even up the rivers. And this was actually what made this kind of really even more devastating storm. There was a lot of rain before the 1938 approach. So you had already swollen rivers, flooded rivers that then when the storm approached and you had the storm surge being forced up, that water kind of flooded into major cities well upriver. So something to kind of as we talked about, these compounding effects can be very devastating. So last thing is just, as we're going into the season, how do you stay informed? I would recommend bookmarking this page, weather.gov OKX tropical. I think kind of looking, once we get starting in the tropical season, so going from June 1st all the way to the end of November, really for us, the peak of the storms, the tropical season, as you're getting into July and really when the waters get warmest into August and September, but even into October, those are really the peaks, part of the season. But you can see the outlook. This is where our colleagues at the National Hurricane Center, they're solely focused on following thunderstorms that are over the Atlantic. How are they gradually developing into potentially a tropical depression, tropical storm, hurricane? Their big picture of what the intensity of that storm is, the size of the storm. If that hurricane, that tropical system potentially could affect us, that's when we start coordinating, and we're going to be providing information on what are the impacts going to be in terms of rainfall, storm surge, winds. What are the magnitude, but really what are the impacts or what are the impacts going to be, and then working with our public safety officials so they can make the best decisions. So these outlooks, you can look at these are updated every day, and you can see even before a storm is named, before there's a kind of what you may be familiar with, the cone, the forecast storm track, the watches and warnings, before any of that comes out, you can see where the Hurricane Center is interested in some of the activity and how maybe it has a low, moderate, or high potential to become a tropical system. So this is good to give you an extra lead time and just keeps you aware of what's going on in the tropics. Specifically for storm surge, once there is a named storm, the Hurricane Center is looking at tons of models, has a lot of experience, a lot of tools, techniques to provide the best forecast, better than any of the individual models themselves or ensemble systems. They have the most accurate forecast in terms of what the intensity of the storm is going to be, what the track of the storm is going to be. Of course, there's inherent uncertainty, and that's that cone that you may see that surrounds that forecast track, and that's based on historical errors in the hurricane track and intensity forecast. But then what you can use is that latest forecast using these the slosh model, the storm surge models. You can run again simulations to give an understanding of what, based on that storm and those historical errors, what is the reasonable worst case storm surge scenario you can see by running, thousands of plausible scenarios, again, compositing those maps and what you see in the upper left. This has really become, a really useful technology to show public safety officials what's the reasonable worst case. If this storm, makes the ideal track maybe just west of your area, right at a time of high tide, when it's really kind of maximized, it's maximized its potential. How high could the water get? And it's important to plan for something like this, these reasonable worst case scenarios, which 9 out of 10 times they're not going to occur, but that 1 out of 10 times that it does, that could mean the loss of life in those areas. And when we're talking about loss of life, we don't want to, play around with that. To kind of help, amplify that information, we have these peak storm surge forecasts, a little bit easier to understand of just generally how high the water could get, and also the storm surge watch warnings if there's potential for life-threatening inundation. So we're talking about water levels 3-4 feet above ground in your area. The storm surge watch is going to give you that understanding that the potential and the warning that it's expected. You'll get wireless emergency alerts. It helps to all these together are helping to amplify each other, to increase the ability to message not only for our public safety officials to make the proper notifications and evacuations, but also let you know that this is a serious situation. And again, why do we want to prepare for a reasonable worst case scenario? Because inherently forecasts have uncertainty, right? Even 24 hours out. As good as the Hurricane Center forecasts have gotten, 24 hours out, you can still have 35 miles of error. So a storm could be, if you look at this image on the right here, 35 miles either to the north, to the south, to the west, or the east can play a big difference on where that storm approaches, what time it's approaching, and we have a tidal range here, right? It could be a big difference if a storm with that peak storm surge approaches during high tide versus low tide. There's a 3 to 5 foot difference in our area between low tide water levels and high tide water levels. So we can't perfectly predict that 24 hours in advance and 48 hours in advance, where a lot of times that's when you want to start making those evacuations, especially for high vulnerability areas. Those are going to have to be based on reasonable worst case information, because if we're waiting for certainty, it's going to be too late. You may not be able to get out. So just to kind of show, this was an example on the left here. This was Hurricane Gloria, the last one that made landfall. It had 6.5 feet of surge. The thing is, it was fortunate. This was at least at the battery. It was fortunate it came in during low tide. And so, that 6.5 feet of surge during low tide, it really only had minor to maybe moderate impacts similar to what we'd see during a winter storm. But if that had occurred during high tide, we could have been looking at impacts that were similar to Sandy with Gloria. But we don't remember that as being a big coastal flooding or storm surge storm. And then on the right here, just to kind of show you what I talked about, 2 days out, you're talking about maybe 70, 80 miles inherent track uncertainty. And so you have a storm that, you look at this point here, the red point. If a storm kind of is, more on the westward side of the storm, which is plausible, that's going to bring pretty good storm surge. You can think of that counterclockwise winds, that water being pushed towards the coast. But if it comes, what would be worse if it comes right, the center, the eye of the storm, that eye wall and that peak wind intensity, the peak surge and wave action, that would be even worse. But say it ends up to the right, it's going to be a lot lesser impacts, because we're actually going to be seeing the backside of the storm, seeing offshore flow. A lot of the worst storm surge is probably going to be more affecting the Cape. But again, we don't know if it's going to be this best case scenario or this worst case scenario. So you really have to plan for that worst case, because these low probability events that have that high consequence, loss of life, we really need to plan for that. So just final thing I'll leave you with is, and I'm sure you're going to be hearing even more about it today. Director Kerner talked about it. Please check with your local safety officials. If you are in a storm surge zone, if you don't know, they can let you know. If you're in a flood zone, riverine, they'll let you know. If you are, you need to develop an evacuation plan. Where are you going to go? What are you going to take? Who are you going to notify? If you're going to stay, you may be in an area that's safe from water and maybe an elevated area, but you're going to be even more susceptible to wind. especially an area like Connecticut. Wind, the amount of trees that's near infrastructure, winds can be very important or very destructive for our area as well. So you want to make sure you have enough supplies, whether it be food, water, medicine, batteries, things like that, for at least 3 to 5 days. If you lose connection with the outside world until help can get with you, and then check on your neighbors, check your home, check your insurance, all that. And I'm sure you'll hear more about that. So thanks again, Doug, for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Nelson. Okay, so our next presentation is going to be from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and they're going to talk about, coastal flooding, some of the projects they work on, and specifically the Stamford Hurricane Barrier, just down the coast from here, that protects the city of Stamford from flooding during storms. So yeah, it's a nice, interesting presentation. Let me put it up on the screen for you there, Meg. And it's Meg Pierce. She's a risk communications lead for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And let me start the animation for you here. Oops. Okay. Take it away, Meg. Oh, sure. Go ahead. Yeah, here, I'll get them for you.
Awesome. So Nelson's presentation is a really great lead into this. We're going to talk about the hurricane evacuation zones and how to find out if you're in one. And then we'll talk about the Corps' infrastructure nearby, which is Stamford Hurricane Barrier. So again, my name is Meg Pierce. I'm the risk communication lead for the New England district, where Sheila works as well. Prior to filling this role, I operated the Corps' dams on the Upper Connecticut River, and I operated Stamford Hurricane Barrier. So hurricane, I thought it was a little bit out of order, but I think we're good here. So the hurricane inundation flood maps are basically a way that you can tell, should I be keeping a heads up attitude? Am I in an area that could potentially be impacted? Nelson kind of hinted earlier at the slosh models. So what that does is we basically look at, here on the left, you can see a whole bunch of plots called a spaghetti plot. And so it's iterations of running a model on the worst case scenario for various storms that could potentially happen. And then it says, given those storms, what would the impacts be? So we figure out the area that could be inundated by looking at the storm surge in the model. So how high will the water rise up given all of those potential storms that could happen? What's the worst case scenario? And so you say, if the water where I'm standing is 5 feet, if you subtract the elevation that your house is at, so let's say you say the slosh model says that the storm surge will rise up to 100 feet at your location. You subtract the ground elevation, and then you know the depth of water. So then looking at that, you can kind of map these potential inundation areas. So if you go on the Connecticut DEMIS website, the models are actually located right on there, and we'll look at a little bit of this data. Some of these slides I'll breeze through a little bit, but the real key here is the QR codes and the website links that can direct you to those resources. And again, like Doug mentioned, these will be emailed out after. So this is just the location information for where you can find the maps on the DEMIS website. And so here the models are shown on the National Hurricane website for the National Weather Service. And so on the National Weather Service webpage, how you can step through them is say, what would be the potential inundation given these various category hurricanes? So up at the top, you'll see that red circle circles category 1. So if you click on category 1, it will say, worst case scenario for category 1 storms, we expect to see this inundation. So then on the map, in the bottom left, there's a little key, and it says the blue areas will say less than 3 feet above the ground. So all of the blue areas would have, possibly 3 feet of water in them. So if you're located in that area, worst case scenario, you could see 3 feet of water. The yellow indicates greater than 3 feet above the ground. The orange is, I believe, 6, and then the red is 9. And so again, there's a QR code and the link to those locations. So here's kind of a bigger blown up picture for New London. So again, looking at a Category 1 storm, you can see that a Category 1 storm just starts to touch the land on the far left. And then moving from left to right, we worsen the storm scenario. So on the left, the Category 1 kind of just barely inundates a little bit of areas. You have some areas with less than 3 feet of water. When you get a little bit closer to the coast, you can see some orange, which is greater than 6 feet. But then, if you crank up the intensity of the hurricane and move to the right, we show a Category 4 hurricane. And so all of that red area is area that would see potentially 9 feet of water. So what can you do with this information? You can know if you're in a hurricane evacuation zone. Look to see if you're in an area that could potentially be impacted. The hurricane evacuation study is listed on our website. Again, just another link of where to find the same information on various locations. And then those inundation zones that we just looked at that are hosted on the DEMIS website, the National Hurricane website, and the Corps' website, all the same information, just 3 different host sites. Those are rolled up into these hurricane evacuation zones to indicate if you should be prepared to possibly evacuate for a hurricane given where you live. So Zone A is recommended that if there were a hurricane Category 1 or 2 or greater hurricane coming up the coast, you should really keep the heads up attitude and be watching the weather because you are in an area that could potentially see evacuation notices. If you're in that light orange area, even more inland, those are areas that could be impacted by larger hurricanes like a Category 3 or a Category 4. The hurricane evacuation zones, like if you want to find out, is my house in an evacuation zone, you can follow this website link here at the Connecticut DEMIS website, and you can type in your address or pan on the map to just figure out where you are and figure out your evacuation zone. So again, there's PDF maps or a live viewer. And then this information is really just used to inform you on if you're in an area that, based on the models, could be impacted. So it's more of a preparatory, awareness situation, and then follow your local evacuation orders, be watching your emergency management websites, as well as be cognizant of how your town puts out the evacuation information. So the Corps also operates Stamford Hurricane Barrier, which is near here, so I just wanted to give a quick highlight and talk about the impacts that has. Sheila likes to say that it shouldn't be called a hurricane barrier, it should be called a high tide barrier because it operates way more than just hurricanes. The hurricanes are an easy decision in terms of operating. We're having a massive storm, so you shut the barrier. It's the high tides that happen much more frequently. The barrier on average closes about 15 times a year that are a little bit trickier. And so here's the area of the whole system. It's actually a system of levees and a navigation barrier. So that's just an overview. And here's how the barrier operates. So this is real-time data on the Reservoir Regulation website. I'll link it here, where the Corps posts live and up-to-date data on the status of its projects. So for the reservoirs, what the pool levels are, how much water is getting released. For Stamford, we have wind data, barometric pressure, we have the tide data, so there's the water level behind the barrier, so the inland side, and then there's the ocean side of the barrier, and all that's posted here and available to anybody in the public. So what these colors show is there's the green line, which is the lower of the two, in case anybody's colorblind. It's the lower of the two squigglies, we'll call them. And then that's following the tide cycle. And then the upper line that's following the tide cycle is actually 2 overlapped pieces of data. So the barrier works like a wall, and it just sits on the ocean floor, and then it raises up just like that. And so when the ocean goes through a tide cycle, right, the water just comes up and down. But if I were to put that piece of paper vertical between my 2 hands, acting like I closed the barrier, the water would come up. And if I shut the barrier, the water on the ocean side would continue to rise up with the high tide. But that water can no longer flow into Stamford's estuary and bay area. So that water would stop rising. That's how it protects it. So it stops the water on both sides of the barrier from moving in sync. And then if you shut it, the ocean continues to rise up, but the Stamford side of the barrier does not. And so the water level stays low, protecting the homes along the water there. And so that purple line that's a little bit more flat, that is the upper line that's following the tide cycles. That represents its two overlapped lines, saying the ocean level and the barrier. But if the barrier is open, the water is flowing from the ocean into Stamford, right? And so that water level's the same. If the barrier is closed, the water moves together. And so here, the lines are overlapping. And that bottom one is what's the astronomical predicted tide cycle based on the moon. So the purple line is just the difference between those lines. So that's the storm surge. So before we talked about the slosh model that predicts the storm surge. So it's the amount that the tide is higher than if it was just up to the moon. So it incorporates the winds, the barometric pressure that might make the tide higher than if it were just the astronomical tide. So when the barrier closes, this is what that looks like. So you have that bottom tide cycle, right? That's just the astronomically predicted tides. And then you have the top line. But what happens there is when the water's coming up at the tide cycle, that highest peak in the middle where it says barrier closed and barrier open, as the water comes up with the high tide cycle, the barrier closes, and then that top line continues to rise. That's the ocean, which is following the natural tide cycle. And then the line where it flattens and kind of cuts off the peak, that's behind the barrier, which is protected. And so it's the ocean, the water level is no longer able to rise up because the rising ocean isn't flowing in there anymore. So this is a little bit of a picture of that. You can see the barrier on the right finger of the water there. So you can kind of see if we were to continue that line of earth and cut it off, as the ocean rises up, the water just can't flow in. And so when the barrier closes, it just prevents the high tide from flowing in. So this protects around 600 acres of land. It was placed into operation in 1969. Like I mentioned, it's a flap gate, so it literally sits on the ocean's floor, and then it rises up just like that. To date, the damages are estimated at over $80 million of protection with all of the operations since its construction in '69, and it operates about 15 times a year. In Sandy, the highest tide was recorded there at 11.1 NGVD is a datum of elevation. The barrier is 17 feet. So as you can see, even though Sandy was the highest tide, this barrier is built extremely large for the typical ocean levels seen there. What goes into deciding to close the barrier? We like to say it's more of an art than a science. It's looking at a lot of the astronomical predicted tides, the wind speed and the directions, the storm surges, as well as the storm runoff from any rainfall. Doug, do you have a low battery? Do you have a charger? Low battery? Yeah. As well as any flow behind the barrier from rainfall runoff.
Let's see if that brings up the charger here. Just keep going and I'll see if we can figure this out.
So right now the barrier's closed for anything predicted to be over a 7.4 tide. It was raised up due to the need for some maintenance and wanting to close the barrier a little bit less, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So if the astronomical tide and the wind and the surge and the inflows behind are expected to exceed 7.4 NGVD, that's when the barrier would get closed to protect Stamford from that high tide or hurricane. So there are currently a few things on the barrier that do need to be repaired. This project has been ongoing for a little bit, and the Corps is awaiting congressional funds for the construction. So it's currently operating. We worked with the city to raise the operating levels to make sure that they were on the same page as us and not seeing the impacts of flooding. So, in the past we closed for a 7-foot tide, and now we're closing for a 7.4. And, as we slowly crept up that limit, the city had officials driving around from the DPW to make sure nobody was seeing effects. And it turns out at 7.4 feet, people still aren't seeing flooding. That was also due to some improvements that the city had made on stormwater management. So, with the modified operations, people are still receiving the same level of protection in terms of what they're seeing on localized levels. And again, we're just waiting on congressional funds to fix the hinges and the gate alignment. Yeah. Yes. Oh, you know what? I think there's one on here. Let's see if I can get this. Hold on one second. Can you see? Yeah, so this is it right here. Yep. So this is the levee portion that I talked about. It's kind of like an earthen embankment here and here. And just in that middle where you see the water flowing, that's where the gate sits on the bottom of the ocean. I don't actually remember how long the barrier is, but if anybody remembers the show Dirty Jobs with Mike Rowe that was on TV a number of years ago, there's an episode on cleaning out the Stamford hurricane barrier. So if you're curious and want to do it's on YouTube somewhere, but it's a cool way to just see the barrier, and he goes down in there and they clean out the sludge every like X years, but it kind of gives you a scale because they climb down into the actual barrier, which is really neat. I believe so. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you talk about this flat barrier. So does the flat go from the ocean towards Stamford? Or
Yeah,
does
let me
it go
see.
from Stamford towards the ocean as it opens?
As it opens, I believe it opens out. So you can't actually open the barrier when the water, you can't open it at a high tide. So as the tide's coming up, you'd close the barrier and then the ocean continues to rise and you have to wait till the ocean comes back down so the pressure on both sides of the barrier is more equal for you to open it. You can't open it if it's like, 11 feet on one side and 4 on the other, hypothetically.
I just wondered if it's blocked towards Stamford or it's blocked towards the
Oh, no, it's, yeah, okay, so this is a little bit weird to describe. So if this is how the barrier comes up, the misalignment is actually this way.
Right, but which side is Stamford on? Is Stamford on that side or on this side?
If this is the actual gate, because this is like a funky way of doing it, Stamford would be this side. So it closes towards Stamford.
But it's misaligned diagonally.
Yes.
Got it. And how does that happen?
Yeah, I'm not sure. They actually, our staff down there does a fantastic job, keeping everything up to date. It is just, it was built in '69, and so now it needs maintenance. Of what, sorry? Oh, I actually don't know, but it is on our website. I can look that up for you when I get back to my seat. Mm-hmm. Very likely if it was built in '69, yes. I'm sure it costs much less than $80 million.
So why have they decided not to build one on this other more upright part on the left? If the one on the right is so successful?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, back in '69, I don't know.
Today, because
Sure.
it's such a populated area and there's pretty expensive place to live. I just wondered why they hadn't.
Well, you could say the same thing hypothetically about like all of Long Island Sound or Boston Harbor.
Cool, I never knew that there was one.
Yeah. It has really big impacts, right? So if you close all of these areas off, like when we shut it, we do close a navigation channel. And so people can't navigate in and out. And so we do have to alert Marine Traffic Control, and they put out the notice to people. So there's a lot of considerations when it comes to choosing where to build these. Well, it's not always bad weather. It could just be a high tide. Yeah, to Sheila's point. Does anybody have any other questions?
Just, if anyone has any questions, please leave the center or mic here,
Oh, great.
just so we can catch it online. Thank you.
comment you can make about the dams? I'm hearing and reading that they need work.
So the Corps dams in New England, like through our inspection process, are doing extremely well. The state is going to speak tonight, right, Doug? DEP is here?
What's that? Yes.
Okay, so they're actually going to speak about their whole,
Oh, but she's not, yeah, I'm sorry, the DEP dam safety folks aren't here because it's a coastal workshop.
Oh,
But we had workshops that were inland that talked about the dams. We had a workshop in Manchester and Waterbury, but unfortunately, this one's dedicated to coastal, so. But we can get you more information on that if you leave us your information. We can get you, I have that presentation, it's called Dam Safety 101.
and it does talk about
What I can do is
all the
include that.
hazard ratings, yeah.
I can include that with the presentations when I send them out tomorrow morning. I'll add that to the group. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, and I think at the end here, oh, Doug, I'll have to send you a new one as well to just make sure. There we
Oh,
go.
sure.
So this one includes the link to the reservoir control website. That's where you can find data on the Stamford Hurricane Barrier, as well as all of the Corps reservoirs across New England. And then in the slides earlier, you saw the links to all of the hurricane evacuation zones and inundation areas. And that's my contact information.
Okay, thank you very much, Meg. Okay, so our next presenter is somebody I've known for 30 years plus, and her name is Diana Ivkovic. She works for the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and she's going to be talking tonight about the National Flood Insurance Program and coastal floodplain regulations in the area here. So I'm going to load up your presentation, Diane. I think so.
I know. You screwed me up in Milford.
All right, so like I said, Diane's been with us since, what, the 1990s?
October of '99.
October of 99. Oh, my God.
Doug hired me. Well, you were one of the
Yeah,
people.
well, I was on the panel.
You were incapacitated.
Second biggest mistake.
All right, which one? What do you-
Advance with this one right here.
Okay.
Yep, yep.
Gotcha. All right,
Got it.
cool. Hi, everyone. I know you're probably like inundated now. You're getting tired, right? Again, I am Diane Ivkovic. I work at the Department of Environmental Protection. I am the state's National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator at NFIP. You've probably heard of this program. You watch the news, disasters and all that kind of stuff. So we're just going to touch on what it is so you understand it, because there's always like a lot of questions about it. So the gentleman from the National Weather Service, the first gentleman, Nelson, I know, I've seen him like 5 times now, I should know who he is, went through all the different storms, past storms in the 50s, 60s, right? So you got a good background of it. So in that time frame, in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of storms in Connecticut, New England, and then around the country. So this is one that occurred in the Gulf Coast area, New Orleans, that area. It was called Hurricane Betsy, happened in 1965. It's singled out because at that time, it was the first billion-dollar storm. They called it Billion-Dollar Betsy, right? So it woke people up a lot. It woke up Congress, it woke up politicians to the fact that these hurricanes were happening a lot and they were causing a lot of damage. So they wanted to do something about it. Sideline, this was also the same area where the Army Corps built a lot of levees after this storm, and then they were damaged in Katrina, just as a little side note. So in 1968, they passed the National Flood Insurance Act. And it has 3 components. Some people, it looks like a stool. That's what the little stool is. 3 components: maps, regulations, and insurance. Okay, so FEMA makes flood maps. When this program first started, it was a HUD program. Again, that was like in the early 70s. Again, it started in 68. Then there's flood regulations. Communities have to adopt the maps and at least the minimum FEMA construction requirements into their local zoning regulations to participate in this program. And then flood insurance. If you are a participating community, FEMA will make insurance available to people and business owners and residents in that community. So what does that mean in Connecticut, right? You don't care about anybody else, right? You want to know what happens in Connecticut. So we are actually one of the the few states where every town participates in this program. Most communities in Connecticut joined somewhere in the 70s or 80s. Again, they all did it at different levels. We have 177 participating communities. Now, I know you always hear 169 cities and towns, but we have a few boroughs, Borough of Stonington, Borough of Fenwick, Groton City and Town. If you have separate zoning, then you participate separately in this program. So, but again, we have full coverage, and the reason is we're pretty built out. There's no unincorporated land, say like, in Maine, where they have big areas where they don't really do anything with it. Out west is kind of like that too. We have big areas. Go ahead.
Is this different than private flood insurance?
Yes, I'll get to that a little bit. Okay, no, you're good. That's a good question. Excellent question. All our towns have maps. They're called flood insurance rate maps or firm maps. All of our towns have regulations, and there's either local zoning. So a zoning regulation or an ordinance that deals with flooding, okay? And Bill Turner talked about this in the very beginning. I know he's not here at the moment, but about buying insurance and about the flood that happened last August.
Cut it
Yeah,
for
sure.
a second.
Go
I
for
just
it.
got a message that they're not seeing the slides online.
Oh,
Let me just see if I can diagnose.
okay.
Let's see here.
That's weird. My mind.
I know, I would suddenly stop sharing, but I'm going to take a look at it here.
That? I like that screen.
There it is.
Who told you that?
One of the guys was watching it.
Oh, okay.
So, okay, now I believe we're being shared again. Okay. All right. Yep.
Okay.
It's up. I don't know why it stopped.
All right. Oh, now I gotta go ahead.
Didn't like it.
Now it's not advancing though.
Oh, go from current slide.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Oh, it is. Yeah, this is one of these where we see something different on the laptop, but on the screen, you're up there. So
Okay.
I'm not sure why.
All right, hold on. It's not doing it then. It's stuck.
Okay, hold on 1 second here, technical issue.
Get out of here.
We're sharing it, but let's see if, let's get onto that screen. Oh, I don't know. There it is. Okay, now I think you're on your screen. Yep. So we'll put you back one slide here. Okay.
All right. You want to check that they can see it?
I've got them on text right now.
All right. Okay. All right, we keep going. Sorry. Technical issues. That always happens. We talked about the flood that happened last August in Oxford and Monroe, and a lot of people didn't have insurance. This is a good point that was brought up at the very beginning, is that because every town participates in this program, everybody can buy flood insurance in this state, either if you're in the mapped floodplain, if you're out of the floodplain, it doesn't matter. Now, again, if you have a mortgage and you're in that mapped floodplain, the bank's going to make you do it. If you're in that mapped floodplain, you pay off your mortgage, you can decide what you want to do. If you're outside the floodplain, then it becomes, your option. But we just wanted you to all know, we got a lot of complaints. The governor's office got a lot of complaints because during that event, which was an extreme event, but a lot of people were caught off guard that they didn't even know they could buy insurance. So that's a little bit of why we're doing this tonight too. Okay? Are we good? Okay? Okay, we're good. Now we're in good shape. A little cartoon, and we hear this a lot. The flood that FEMA uses as a measuring stick is called the 100-year flood. So you can have 10-year floods, like stormwater management systems are usually a 10-year flood, like the catch basins. You can have a big Noah's Ark 500-year flood. The one in Monroe last year was around 1,000, they thought, okay? FEMA uses 100, but this is what we hear a lot, and it's a mistake, a myth, a miscalculation. These are a statistic, so I want you to think of it. We hear a lot of residents say, well, it happened this year, and then like 100 years later, and I'll be dead, I'll be moved, my kids will have the problem, whatever it is. You can have a 100-year flood 3 times in a year or wait 200 years. Think of it more like Powerball, and the numbers come up in the balls. It's kind of like a statistical probability, so I just want to put that one out there because we hear that a lot. All right, flood maps. Again, they are called flood insurance rate maps or firm maps. They're based on engineering. So sometimes you'll hear, if you go to the Inland Wetlands Commission, and they talk about floodplain soils and stuff, that's different. They're using a soil thing. FEMA's using engineering, so it's an engineering model. They take all, so Meg had a nice picture of all the different spaghetti plots. So they go from a point in time, when I say they, I mean FEMA, they go backward, so these are not sea level rise maps, they don't go forward. They go back, they take historic data for rainfall, hurricanes, and they run different models and they pick the worst case scenario. It's put into a model and then it makes a map, okay? We're gonna see that in a second. So this is not a flood map, this is just to orient you. And it's got a cactus in it, so it's not even from here. So this is just so you have a visual first. So you're standing, say, fly fishing or kayaking in the middle of that river, and you're looking down the river. The middle of the channel is called a floodway. It's kind of a no-build zone. And then as the flood rises, it's going to spill over the banks, and people are going to build in that what they call the fringe area there, okay? But that's the whole 100-year floodplain. So again, it's a model. How deep that channel is, how the elevation, how much water is going to go into it. So I want you to do a comparison in your head. Think of the Connecticut River or the Housatonic, and then some little brook running in your backyard, and the difference of how those look and how much water can be dumped into one and not into another, okay? Does that make sense? And riverine areas, they have something called AE zones. Those are the flood zones, AE, or you can see an A or an AE. So that's in a riverine area, you always see it as an A, and you're going to see it in a second. Here's a real flood map. Now you're looking down like a bird. All right, before you were looking this way, you were standing. Now you're the bird looking down. So that middle area with the red is the floodway. That's like a no-build area. And then the blue, see where it says AE at the top? Maybe you can see it, maybe you can't. The blue area is a 100-year floodplain. The brown, tanny is a 500-year floodplain, so it's even more flooding, less likely to flood. It'd be a bigger event. The little squiggly lines are what you call the base flood elevations. So I see a 50, I see a 49. That's how high the water, Meg said it. You have to take your land elevation, so it's not going to be 50 feet of water. So if you, see your face. So if your land elevation is 45, then you're going to get 5 feet of water. Does that make sense? Okay? I know. This is an inland location, okay? This map, by looking at it, also tells me that the bottom of the screen is higher than the top because you've got this area where you don't see anything, you just see an aerial. That's like least likely flooding. So the bottom is like a higher elevation. It's going to go in like this. Does that make sense? All right, now we get to coastal. So coastal, again, left to right. Left, you're starting in the ocean. So think of going in the ocean and you're walking up the beach. Pick your beach, pick wherever you like. And you're heading up the beach, left to right, okay? So the left is Long Island Sound or the ocean. The first zone you're going to hit, which is different, you're not going to see this in an inland location, something called a V zone or a VE zone. V stands for velocity, means waves. Again, Nelson talked about that. Fetch, the distance of wind over water and pushing and making waves. That's what that is. So when a 3-foot wave can't be sustained anymore, then that V zone becomes a coastal A zone. That middle area there, it still has wave action, just less. Then there's a little thing at the top, it says LIMWA. I don't know if you could see it, and it breaks the two zones apart, the two A zones. That stands for limit of moderate wave action. So then, again, it's hitting a lot of things in there. Land is going up, it's hitting seawalls, it's hitting houses, it's hitting rocks, it's hitting all that. So the wave keeps breaking as it's moving in, right? Eventually it's going to stop because the land gets too high or something gets in its way. Okay? So then that coastal A becomes a normal A, and that's similar to the riverine one. And then you keep going back, and you hit something called an X. Again, not that it can't flood, but it's less likely that it's going to flood. So here's just a picture of a flood map, okay? Again, you're a bird looking down, all right? The other one, you were looking this way. This is a real flood map, I think from Georgia or someplace, Florida, whoever. Again, you're coming from the bottom up, you see the V zones, then you see that Limwa line, that little black line with the little flags. And you keep going back and it becomes different A zones. And then in the back there, you get that 500-year brown zone. And then you see it just barely at the top there, you see like a little nothing, little nubby zone. If you went further back, you might see, you know, just normal X zone where there is no flooding, okay? So where can you get flood maps? And again, they talk about evacuation maps. Those are for evacuation purposes, and they're very conservative to get people to get out of a certain area. Flood maps are regulatory in the sense of construction, okay? So that's how they're different. Not that you can't use them for evacuation, because you definitely can. And look at the floodplain around you and streets that get cut off. But they are kind of used for different purposes. But anyway, you can get them online. If you Google FEMA flood map, map service center, whatever, you will find this. There's a little box you can plug in where it says number 1 there. You can plug in your address. The map will come up. A little digital map will come up with a pin. I would say make sure you look at where the pin really is, because sometimes if you have a weird address, it might not place it right. If you see blue, that means you're in the 100-year floodplain. Any of that blue color up there, that's it, okay? You can also get them at town halls. If you want hard copies, usually your planning office, town engineer, they have them, okay? And I'm sure they'd be happy to print them for you. And they look just like that. It's a booklet and a little Z-fold map, you know, the little AAA old-fashioned maps. They actually do look like that. All right, now I do regulations, quick. Again, like I said, every town participates. I'm sure many of you have had to maybe go to town hall and get a permit and you're in the floodplain and they put you through a meat grinder of regulatory things that you have to do. Like I said, all towns participate in this program, and the reason is twofold actually that most towns want to participate. One is for insurance and mortgages. Because a mortgage, to sell a house, you know, most of the time you're getting a mortgage. If you didn't have flood insurance, the option to buy it, it would stop that real estate transaction, especially in a coastal town where you have a lot of turnover. In an inland town where maybe there wasn't a lot going on, it would take a while, but I'll tell you, in a town like Darien, it would be not even 10 minutes before you get a call to your selectman saying, what the heck are you doing? Why aren't you participating in this program? Because you can't sell anything. The other one is disaster assistance. You have to participate in this program a community does to get federal disaster assistance, what they call public assistance or PA money. That's the money a town gets to put back together like your bridges and stuff like that, okay? So if they didn't do it, they'd make them do it and then give them the money, and that's FEMA. But we all do that, and again, because we want to make sure we're getting our money here, you know, as long as it lasts. Okay, so permitting. Normal permitting, you don't come to me, you don't come to the state unless there was a state money involved, and we're not going to go into that tonight. You go to your normal zoning officer, the building permit. The state building code also has these standards, so you're not going to get away from it, okay? Again, a couple pictures. This was either Irene or Sandy in East Haven. Not sure which one, can't remember. And then this is Old Saybrook. Again, just to set the scene of what floods can do. I know you know, you've seen some great pictures tonight. So now, when we talk about the regs, why are the regs in place? So there's different flood forces in play, and the regs are trying to counterbalance that. So first one is hydrostatic. Static means standing water. So think of standing water. Sometimes you're like in a swimming pool, you feel the weight of water on you, or something where you've been somewhere where you feel water, like in the ocean. Water is heavy. So this will like push the foundation in. Here's a little graphic. I always give Doug credit. Doug made these like 20 years ago or whatever. I still use them, Doug. They're good enough. Good enough for government work, as they say. All right, so it'll collapse the foundation. Next one is hydrodynamic. Dynamic means motion, right? Movement of water. So this is like water either pushing it off the foundation or pushing the foundation out from under the house, either one. Again, Doug's little pictures here. And then buoyancy. We all know this one. It's buoyancy is pushing up thrust. Another one, debris impact. You'd be surprised what is in floodwater. I think it was Irene, we had propane tanks float down from Vermont that had to be collected because they will crash into your house and explode. But anything could be debris and it can cause damage to your house if it's too low. All right, so in a coastal zone, you've probably seen this in Darien, or anywhere, Fairfield, you go to the coast. It's a house on stilts, all right, or a business on stilts. So in a V zone or that coastal A zone, this is the kind of thing you're going to see. The underneath is open or it has breakaway walls. It doesn't have utilities. You can't live down there. It's something that's on stilts. And the flood is going to go underneath that house and hopefully go out the other side with very few obstructions, okay? So it causes less damage. So for an inland location, you don't have to do the house on stilts, but you're going to do something called flood vents. So you're going to live in that red part on the top. It's elevated. The bottom is basically a unfinished garage, let's say, and it's got vents in the foundation. The vents are going to let that water in and out. So it's a floodable space. You can't have any living space down there, but you could park, you can put your stuff. But that's what you would do in a riverine or that coastal area way in the back, okay? Remember that one, not in the one in the front. Oh, there. Another picture of that. So say you didn't want a garage underneath, you wanted it to the side, and you just wanted a crawl space, you could do it that way too, okay? Options. Commercial, now this is just for inland riverine locations. For a non-residential building, they will also let you what they call dry flood. The last one was called wet flood proof because water's allowed in. This was called dry because they put a barrier around the building, they put like a gasket at the door, and there's human intervention where the other ones do not have it. Okay? That's more for a commercial building of any kind. Oh, sure. Sure. Hopefully I do. Oh, hold on here.
Oh, okay,
All right, Doug, which way do I go back?
Easy peasy. I'll show you how to right clicker.
I know. I think I went too far. Go back. This one?
This one here?
One more?
One more.
Okay. Oh, well, you have to actually do that.
Yeah, you have to actually do that.
That one? Remember, he's going to send you these tonight, too.
Yeah.
But you can, that's fine. This is actually in FEMA Technical Bulletin 11, so if you'd Googled it, you could find this at home if you wanted to, okay? All right, we're done with that one. All right, now we're doing flood insurance, quick. The lady here asked about private policies. We'll get to that in a second. So, again, thinking back last August, a lot of people didn't have insurance in Monroe and Oxford because they thought their homeowner's policy covered everything. So a homeowner's policy is a fire and a wind policy, basically. That's what it covers, normally. And it does not have any flood coverage. Okay, so here's how you kind of discern that in your head. If water falls from the sky, so say a wind event rips your roof off or part of your roof off, and water comes in from the sky, that would fall under your homeowner's policy. They don't call that a flood. That's wind damage, all right? And then the water is like ancillary to that. A broken pipe, sewer, usually your homeowner's policy has a rider or extra coverage for that if you purchase it, not always. If water flows over the ground from a water course or the ocean or in any form, that is something that's covered under a separate flood insurance policy, okay? So again, the first gentleman, Mr. Turner, he said you might want to talk about, looking at your insurance policies. That's what you want to know if you have that or not. Okay, so FEMA will sell you, we're going to get there in a second. We're going to do it now. Here's your private policy, okay? So the National Flood Insurance Program, you could buy insurance inside the floodplain, outside the map floodplain in Connecticut. You could purchase it. You don't have to go to FEMA and get it. A lot of people are afraid of that. I don't know. You can do it, but you don't have to. There's something called Write Your Own or WYO carriers. There are normal insurance companies, State Farm, Allstate. Again, you can Google that. And they are basically a middleman for the government. You're buying a federal policy, but they kind of service the policy. They will send their adjuster and all that kind of stuff. It covers building and contents. There are two types of coverage. Building is the foundation, utilities and stuff like that, structural things. And that's what a bank would want if you have a mortgage, all right? That's the only thing you need to buy. Then there's contents. That's your stuff, all right, your furniture and that kind of stuff. Residential policy has a $250,000 limit for a building, $100 for contents. Non-residential, 500 and 500, you can read it there. And then condos are 100 times for contents and then 250 times the number of units. So that would be bought by like the association, you know. Renters can also buy it for content. So private, I don't go crazy in private. There has been lately a growing market of companies that sell private flood insurance. It is not backed by the federal government, it is not regulated, but what they do is try to mirror the policy of the federal government so the bank will accept it. Okay, so you'll see these kind of limits and coverage because most of people are buying it for a mortgage and they want to make sure the bank will accept it. If you are in an inland location, if you've never had claims, if you've never had disaster assistance, those private people like will cherry pick. They don't want you on the coast usually. They don't want you if you've had claims. They don't want you if you've had disaster. Remember, insurance companies trying to make money. Sometimes the premiums are lower. Again, if you're inland usually. You know, call around. You definitely can find it. But they will also, the difference too is if you have a claim or whatever, they will drop you. The federal government will never drop you if you make a claim. I guess if you wanted to, yeah.
Well, I think there's limits.
Sure, I guess you could, yeah. You could. All right, go ahead. Federal government. Yeah. No, but they should, because it's kind of low. There's talk of that. There's talk. Go ahead.
Diane, I'm curious about the conversations going on in Connecticut about the NFIP and the continuation of the NFIP. Virtually every state has a market for residual business, homeowners, medical malpractice, workers' compensation, automobile. There are some who believe that the NFIP should be transitioned into, and it's the idea, we don't know what's going to happen with Homeland Security, what's going to happen with NFIP management. But, you know, in a sense, we do this all the time with automobiles and types of liability insurance and get the federal government out of that. Is there any conversation about that?
You know, as we've all seen in the last few months, you know, anything goes. It definitely could be, you know, there's been talk of FEMA evaporating. There's been talk of this program being canceled. You know, I do not make those decisions. That's Congress and or executive orders. So it's entirely possible that this could evaporate and you'd all have to go find private policies or go to Lloyd's of London. I have no idea.
The irony of the NFIP is that for the first 30 years it was making money and the federal government was milking it, taking money off the top, but starting with Katrina in 2005, it's been losing money.
Yeah,
so that's the irony is if the government had simply left it to its own devices, it would be funded today without a loss. But they kept siphoning off the NFIP when it was making money in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then they didn't have the money to put it back out to the policyholders when the big storms hit, starting in 2005.
Yeah, Katrina was
Yeah.
it had too many claims. I mean, you have to realize the federal government is not trying to make a profit, they're just trying to break even. Where a private company, you know, they have shareholders, they want to make a profit. They may have to.
Yeah, but the rates would be much higher. NFIP insurance is subsidized by the government, so if you buy it from a private insurer, you're going to pay more. Well, that's the thing. Yeah, it depends on where you are. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we pay, you're right, we pay more into it than we get out. You're correct.
Yep.
Then like, we're not Louisiana or Texas or Florida.
Yep,
You're correct.
that is true. Yep.
Yeah, it's true. All right, keep going here. Again, a couple things, again, you wanted to know what normal homeowners can do, a couple things. You'd be surprised, cleaning out drains and gutters, repitching, regrading your water away from your house. It's the simple things. If you want to go hog wild, you can elevate your house or just like utility equipment. Again, if you're going to change out your electrical board anyway, you know you're in a floodplain, maybe you just jack it up a foot or two, or a water heater or something like that. Go ahead.
Things like, your drains overflowing and you're getting water in your basement, is that considered a flood in terms of insurance?
It's got to be overland and coming in. So if it's coming up from a drain, that's permanent. Like what I would tell you to do is put a backflow flapper valve so it stops it.
Or like, your gutters overflow and it just seeps through
Yeah.
your foundation or something.
You'd be just surprised what people just, it's pitching thing. It's just going out, I hate to say it, you go outside, I do it in my own house. You go outside when it rains and you walk around the house and you see where the water is coming, and that's where you have to do something to it. But we get a lot of, just complaints like that, and sometimes
There's a
it's
lot of
simple.
basement seepage flooding in Connecticut.
Yeah,
It's just the way
there is.
our landform is and
Yeah.
how much heavy rain we get here, too.
Yeah. Again, a couple guides there. One is called the FEMA's Homeowner's Guide to Retrofitting. It gives kind of ideas like this. And then another one, reducefloodrisk.org. That's a website from the Association of Floodplain Managers. That's what ASFPM stands for. And again, it's more geared toward normal people, ideas for normal people, okay, like you. And again, insurance, where it rains, it can flood. For business owners, I don't know if we have business owners here. Again, if you Google DEP, we have a couple little videos. Chemical Management and Climate Resilience Group put out a couple videos that are geared more toward businesses. They're only like 5 minutes. The last one is 30 minutes. You could watch it too. You probably get it. It has to do more with chemicals and what a business can do for a storm, a business plan. But again, you can watch it. They're interesting. The sub-base one is interesting, if you like subs. There's me. That's it. I quit.
Okay, thank you very much, Diane.
Oh, geez.
Okay. So, I like to use the analogy of a cell phone here for our next presenter. We all know what phones were 30 years ago. If you had a cell phone, you could make a phone call with it, and that was it. Today, the cell phone is very powerful. It's a miniature computer. It's not so mini, and very, very powerful. So, computer power over the last couple of decades has increased exponentially, and Dr. Zimmerman from our Connecticut GIS department is going to show you what GIS can do for you in a flooding situation. So we're going to go ahead and open this up. Okay. What's that?
That's not the right presentation.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's Jim O'Donnell.
That's UConn. Let me grab the other one here. Here it is, right there. Okay.
We got a mouse to work with.
I'll start it for you. Yeah, we have, it's this pad right here.
Okay. And then use the arrow keys to advance.
Yeah, and you can, whoops, let me enable that content there. Uh-oh, here we go again. Shoot.
Enable the content if you can, you can get that.
Oh, I might be able to
It's
just
like,
hit
it's like
enter.
Robin Hood.
There it goes,
There you
okay.
go.
Now I've got it, okay.
All right.
Take it away.
I guess I have a mouse. Okay. I'll be quick. I know it's been a long night. Appreciate you coming. My name is Carl Zimmerman. I'm from the Connecticut GIS office. And I'm not a hurricane guy. I'm not a flood person. I'm actually a data person. And where I work, we deal with location and geographic data, okay? And the nice thing about geographic data is that it allows you, And a lot of the things you've seen have been underlaid by this. It allows you to create scenarios and models that can simulate hurricanes. And so our niche in the state is that we have the data that allows you to do a lot of this modeling. And we have it recent and we have it very fine scale. So you'll see some information that actually is at the scale of your yard, your front yard, your street, or your neighborhood. So FEMA and USGS and other big federal agencies tend to work in more regional scales. This set of data allows you to look actually at the neighborhood scale. So with that, I'll go forward. Okay, again, I'm from the GIS office. Our job is basically to manage and provide this geographic information. We have a new set of aerial imagery. If some of you have looked at your parcel data from the town of Darien, that data most likely comes from us. We also provide things like soils data. We'll talk a little bit about LiDAR data, which is elevation data. So it's a bunch of data. And as Doug mentioned, because of computing power, we can simulate something across the entire state. So instead of just doing, I start off as a landscape architect. So I would, one of my first jobs is to hand contour 640 acres of the Sharpie. It took me like 4 days. I was very proud of it, but then when I took a GIS class, I could do it in 5 seconds. And this is what the scale of this allows you to do. It allows you to look at environmental problems at scale across the entire state in a very rapid way so that you can try out different scenarios. This is our home for our office, so there's a bunch of resources on here. You can look at digital mapping on here and play around with that. We don't have time for that today. I will say at the end, I did put a little link to a web map that shows coastal inundation, flooding, and buildings. It's site level, so you can pull up your own house on it. I don't think we have time to show it. I wanted to talk a little bit about GIS data because this underlies everything you've seen, and I just want you to have a framework in your head. So on the left, that's an aerial image. It's called a raster. It basically is like your digital camera, right? But the thing about this one is that it sits on a geographic format. So if you go to that, say that building on the top, on that map, you are in exactly the right location spatially. So once you have that, you can add other things with it. And that's the beauty of this GIS software, is that you can combine different data together and you know what the spatial relationship is almost exactly. In the middle, you have elevation data. This is called LiDAR. This is, imagine a giant cloud of points, each point in exactly the right location. And so with that, you can find the location of your trees, your top of your building, and you have that all over the entire state. So again, you combine all these data sets together, and you have a model of reality that you can use for hurricane scenarios. Okay, the one you may be most familiar with is the vector data. This is something you'd would have seen in your algebra or geometry class a long time ago. The key fundamentals here are the point, line, and polygon. So a point might represent a light pole. A line might represent the middle of a street. So you create a system of lines and points, and then you have the streetscape, the fire hydrants, the trees, and then a polygon could represent your building footprint. So these are the primitive elements of a GIS, and together they all sit in this geographic system, and again, they allow you to model environmental data like we've seen. Yeah? Yes, but in this case, typically what you have is a plane you fly over. One flew over in 2023, and they shoot a little laser down. It basically bounces off the ground and goes back to a sensor in the plane, and they know exactly how long that takes. And it turns out that gives you an accuracy to about 1/10 of a foot. So there's like if you look at our data set, there's like 1 trillion points across every foot across the entire state, and those are accurate to 1/10 of a foot. So in this problem, you can see on the left here, see those contours? That's like an engineering-looking drawing. Those are actually from the LiDAR points. So you can tell on a parking lot now which way the water is flowing with this data set. So it used to be that you didn't have this accuracy. Now you have local site-level accuracy of the water. So on the left, you see how that V shape is? The water is running right down the middle of that V shape, right to left. So we have that for the entire state now. So no longer think about data in terms of your site, but think about the whole state this way. All right? And on the right, this is an elevation model. I think Diane mentioned this, but basically at each and every point across the state, we know within 1/10 of a foot what that elevation is. So you can combine these things together and then make a viable model for a hurricane inundation. Again, just real quick, the nice thing about this GIS approach is that you can represent reality, and it's all layered together in a geographic framework. So you know relationships between things spatially, and the scale goes up and down. Because it's digital, you can say, oh, I've got you can start counting things like I've got 1,000 cars in this parking lot, I've got 10,000 cars in the city, I've got 100,000 cars across the state, and you can use the same data set to do it in different ways. And we can use that for buildings and hurricanes too. You've seen this already, but we're going to combine the elevation data set I showed you and the polygon representing buildings together. So this is two little worst case scenarios, and don't really get, unlike our first speaker, I'm not really here to quibble over it, whether it's 9.6 feet or 10 feet or 3 feet. The idea here is we're looking at a scenario here. It's a planning scenario. Just like, and as an emergency management professional, I think about where should I put my resources? This is a way of doing that. So we'll look at this area in the middle of the state, right between basically where you all are and Brantford. 180,000 buildings in that area. Let's first look at this area. This is Brantford. I really love this location. So on the left, everything in yellow is the 10-foot surge, and the kind of red, pale red is 15-foot surge. You notice most of it's 10 feet or less. But this is in an estuary area. Look how far inland that 10-foot level goes, okay? And again, we're using exact data. So people kind of think about a hurricane as a coastal phenomenon, and it's true, that's where a lot of the damage is, but it doesn't mean it can't run very far inland, all the way to 95. And also, and I've seen this in Darien as well, if you look on the right here, you see the buildings on those little black dots. Most of this area is built above the 10-foot storm surge, which means people are doing their job, but there are specific locations, like the one in the circle there, where you have homes that are substantially below that. Those are where you have much higher risk. And if you're an emergency management professional, you want to look at this and identify those areas so that when you have a big storm coming, you know this is a place to prioritize resources, potentially. This is probably one of my favorite slides here. This is Korsky Field. I believe we saw a picture of this before. This is near Stratford, just down the road from us here. So the yellow line is, again, the 10-foot, and the red line is the 15-foot inundation. And you can see the red line goes all the way past 95. But in general, the actual elevation is all roughly like 8 or 10 feet, so probably it doesn't get inundated very often. But what I wanted to show you is in that black square, and this is where having this site-level information, like specific locations of elevation across the entire state helps you. Notice that little area of yellow and orange colors in the middle there? Those are at 2 and 4 feet, not 8 and 10 feet. So even though overall this area is very flat and probably mostly above most of the storms that occur, there are actually smaller spots in this site that are at much higher risk for flooding in smaller storms. And so again, this is where this local information, this local elevation gives you more knowledge about how to plan for a storm. This is an example in West Haven. I nearly bought a house right here, so I'm very familiar with it. One of the things I like about this is that, where Morris Park is, they were very smart in West Haven. They didn't build anything. And so in general, even though a bigger storm would run inland, there's not that many buildings that are actually below the 10-foot. But again, if you look on the left here, you'll see there are little areas where you have these oranges and yellows that are much lower, and again, these would be at higher risk in smaller storms. Okay, this next two slides are probably, I think, the most important ones I'll present. So this is Silver Sands area, and this is a back bay. There's a little estuary. You see that kind of arcing line behind the buildings here? That's a little back bay. You have a lot of houses that are built right on the water. I'm sure it's spectacular, but it's also feels risky, doesn't it? Let's look at the right here, okay? So the red color is the highest elevation, and then as you get the lower colors there, like yellows, those are lower elevations. So in fact, if you look at the coast here on the right, going kind of left to right, those houses are higher than the ones behind them. So it kind of flips what your expectations are at the coast, right? So these buildings are higher, but they're close to the wave action. But now you go farther back, and the colors get yellow. Now look carefully on the left here. This is the blow-up of it. That, I believe, is Cooper Street, the lowest one of the streets that go back. Notice the color, that's orange, okay? So in fact, what's happened is that when they built that, whenever that was, they actually filled that area, okay? So it's up higher than the surrounding, but the next street up, which is, I don't remember which one, but the next street up is yellow. So what that tells you is that street is in fact 2 or 3 feet lower than the street next to it. So in a storm, the big storm, the water will come over that front and fill up that back bay, and the water come back this way back towards the higher ground. And that street in particular will be much more likely to flood. And if you look at the street level, you can see a lot of those houses aren't built on stilts. They're in fact at ground, and so these are much higher risk areas. So this is the kind of thing you can use the site level data as an emergency management professional to prioritize your work if you know a storm is coming. And just kind of this, I mentioned this ability to summarize things. So in this area, these areas I showed you, that's 9,300 buildings would be impacted by the 10-foot surge, 1,800 that 15-foot surge, and that's again close to $7 to $10 billion worth of possible assessed damage. So these are very, very big numbers, and the GIS system allows you to summarize the site level knowledge across a whole region. And Diane showed you this, the FEMA flood zone, so I won't belabor that point, but just remember the AE is slightly less common than the VE. And I'll just quickly show you a couple summaries. So across the entire state, you have these AE zones. Because we know exactly where all the buildings are, there are 34,000 buildings within that AE zone. That's a large number to keep track of. And interestingly, almost 2,000 or 4,000 square feet or more, which represents probably commercial buildings. So those would be things that might be grocery stores or other kinds of higher value commercial type real estate. And then the VE, where the highest wave impacts are and the most frequent occurrences, there's still almost 5,000 in Connecticut that are within that VE zone. So these are all, anytime there's a big storm, these places have to pay attention. And finally, I just want to leave with this. This is the FEMA flood map, and generally they get the topography right, but if you look at the next slide, you see all those white squiggly lines, those are contours, and notice the contour lines don't match the FEMA flood zones very well. They generally have it right, but not exactly, and so I want you to think of it always is that what Diane had said, around your house, take a look at where the drains are, the ditches are, the culverts are, that you have microtopography. I think our next speaker will talk about this. Microtopography is what really impacts each and every house. So generally, the bigger zones tell you a lot of information, but always be aware of what's happening on your own property. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Zimmerman. So that was a packed presentation. Thank you. So we have our final presentation for the night is going to be from the University of Connecticut. See if I can minimize this. So, and maximize the University of Connecticut. So, Mark DeVoe is going to be talking about sea level rise, climate change, and how it might affect flooding in the future. So, take it away. Go ahead and share your screen.
All righty. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me, Douglas?
Yes, we can hear you just fine, Mark.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Mark DeVos. I'm a research associate at UConn's Circa Applied Research Group, and I'm presenting this evening on behalf of my director, Jim O'Donnell, who some of you may have seen speak before, and our colleague, the Executive Director of Research, Dr. Yaprak Onat. So it's nice for me to be here. I'm normally on the back end of this. I'm a modeler, so I work with numerical models, developing the kinds of information products that you've seen, thus far in the evening so far. So it's nice for me to speak to communities where the rubber hits the road and try and explain a little bit about what we do in the background. So this evening's presentation I see on the agenda was shared as the impact of climate change on coastal flooding. Doug, it seems like I'm not able to advance the slide here. Let me just. Oh, wait, there we go.
There you go.
Apologies. Let me just reshare this. All right, are you seeing the PowerPoint again?
Yes, we are.
All righty. So although the title kind of talks generally about climate change, I did want to just make a note that tonight will be mostly about sea level rise and the specific climate change impact of sea level rise on coastal flooding, because of course hurricanes are closely connected to coastal flooding. But if you are interested in the more general impacts of climate change, including those from precipitation and temperature, Circa is also working on 2 documents which we hope to release later this year. The first one will be a peer-reviewed academic-style paper, which is evaluating a range of climate projections with a specific emphasis on the state of Connecticut. And what we're trying to do there is be very strict in our assessment of the reliability of these climate projections thus far on the climate that we've observed in Connecticut thus far. And then the second document will be a more public-facing report-style document for use by planners and managers and residents on the general impacts of climate change that we can expect so far based on what we're seeing in the climate projections. But like I say, tonight will be focused on sea level rise. So there's a quick outline. I'm going to talk to you about mean sea level in Long Island Sound from measurement. That is what we observe, not from computer models, but what we actually measure from the various tide gauges around the state. I will show you how small changes in the mean sea level create large changes in flood risk. So we often hear, figures 10 inches, 20 inches, which doesn't sound like a lot in the context of a 4-foot, storm surge or tide. But I'll show you how those small changes in the mean sea level can actually make a major difference to your flood risk. I'll explain a little bit about the Circa guidance, which we circulated around 2019 of 20 inches by 2050 and where that came from. And then I'll also talk a little bit about our latest update to that guidance and why it actually hasn't changed much. So there's a spoiler for you. And then I'll end off just by looking at 2 quick examples of the sort of very local, we call it hyperlocal flood risk modeling that we're doing at Circa, and how the risk is changing due to sea level rise. So this is kind of a point of departure. Flood hazard planning requires the accurate estimation of the total water level. The total water level, the total water elevation along your shoreline is what is going to cause flooding or not. And total water level is the combination of the astronomical tide and the surge. But where those oscillations hang around, where that combination acts from, is of course the mean sea level. So if the mean sea level goes up, then the entire system of tide and storm surge is acting from an elevated baseline, and vice versa. So that's why it's key to estimate total water levels against a background understanding of the mean sea level. So that's why we're so worried about the mean sea level. And that's why we say that Connecticut should plan for a mean sea level rise of up to 20 inches by 2050 in Long Island Sound because of this augmentation that it has to your flood risk. So this is Long Island Sound. I'm sure you're all familiar with this kind of a map. And what I highlighted here are all the various tide gauge locations, and the dates that Jim O'Donnell has put up there are basically when those records started. So we're quite privileged in this part of the world that we have a number of records, and quite a few of those records are quite long. And so what that does is it gives us an ability to check whether sea levels are increasing from measurement, but it also gives us the ability to calibrate and measure the reliability of sea level rise projections as they elapse. So this graph shows you the sea level. On the y-axis is the actual sea level, and you've got it on meters on the left-hand side and in feet on the right-hand side of the vertical axis. And on the bottom is a time record starting in the early 1930s, working its way up to pretty much the present time from these various tide gauges. So each line is colored by the tide gauge from which it was taken. And what you can see here is a couple things. Firstly, you've got these wiggles, right? So you can see that the sea level actually has these natural oscillations, periods of 5 to 10, sometimes 15 years, where the sea level is particularly elevated or depressed. And that's not necessarily climate change. That's natural variability, and that's associated with large-scale, very slow-moving and long-term natural climate variability. I'm sure you've heard of El Nino and La Nina. That's a long-term climate variability cycle called ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. That's probably the most famous of the long-term, what we call low-frequency natural cycles of climate variability. And there are others. One of them is the North Atlantic Oscillation, and there are lots of them. And these are the kinds of things that cause these wiggles that you see lasting a couple of years. So the fact that you had a particularly high sea level in year X, or in decade Y, is not necessarily the result of climate change. It may be that you're at the peak of one of these natural cycles. And I think this is important because we often hear the throwaway line that, the climate has always changed, weather has always changed, as if, the people looking at these things aren't aware of this. And just to say, put your mind at rest that we are keenly aware of this, and there are ways, to take these things into account when we develop the statistics. But aside from these natural oscillations, you can see that there's a very clear linear trend as well. And that's the climate change signal. That's how climate change is manifesting in the sea level records not from computer models, but as they've been measured around the Long Island Sound. So you can see that things are clearly changing. Let's talk about storm surge, and I'm privileged here because I'm the last presentation and people have done a very good job of explaining what surge is. But if you look at the graph that's visible there, in the blue is the water elevation that we expect based on the normal astronomical tide, the pull of the moon and the sun on the Earth's waters. The blue curve is what we would expect the water elevation to be. But then, of course, we've got onshore winds, we've got waves that push the water up alongside the coastline, and we've got low atmospheric pressure, and that gives rise to the green curve, which is the sort of excess water level over and above what we would expect from the tide. And the difference between that expected tide and what you actually got because of the weather is what we call the surge. Now, if I add this graph, what we've done here is just graphed the surge, right? So we've taken out the tide, and we've just graphed the surge. And the note that's been made on the right-hand side there says that places that flood now, when the surge is 4 foot, have a 5 out of 80 risk per year. Now, what does that mean? That means that Professor O'Donnell has counted the number of times that these surges cross that 4-foot line, which is marked with a sort of orangey red color. And there are 5 crossings of that 4-foot line in an 80-year record. That's where he's put that sort of random sounding number, 5 in 80 years. Now, he rendered the same graph, but he added 20 inches of sea level rise to that same surge graph. And suddenly, the number of crossings of that 4-foot threshold increased to 48 in 80 years. So you can see that with a 20-inch, half a meter, not much in the context of the tidal range, with a 20-inch change in the mean sea level, we suddenly have, almost an 8-fold increase in the number of 4-foot storm surge events for this particular place, which is New London. So to formalize that statistically, what we do is we look all around the state and we apply a technique called extreme value analysis. And these are just statistical techniques of basically looking at, the tail end of a distribution, meaning the very extreme, very improbable events that are few and far between, but have a very high impact. That's called extreme value analysis. And this is a very complicated looking graph, but there's really only one important thing that I want you to look at. So again, on the left-hand side, the vertical axis, we've got water levels, this time in meters. And on the bottom here, we've got the return interval. So how often, how many times, how many times would a specific water level roll around? Would it be once every 10 years, once every 100 years, and so on? It's a logarithmic scale, so just so that we can fit many years onto one graph, but 10 to the 1 is 10 years, and 10 to the 2 is 100 years. And the only curve that I want you to pay attention to, because we don't have much time, is this curve. So what you can see here is that at the 10-year return interval. In other words, once every 10 years, we can expect a water level of 1.45 meters, roughly. Right? So multiply that by 3 roughly to get it in feet. But if we were to increase the sea level by half a meter or 25 centimeters, that curve raises to there. And if we then look at what the same water level, that same 1.45 water level would be, suddenly the return interval is 2.5 years. And so again, you can see that with a very modest, this time 25 centimeters, so half of 20, that's about 10 inches, you increase the flood risk fourfold with that modest increase in the sea level. Now, you would have heard frequently from anybody talking about climate change that you can expect extreme events to increase in intensity or magnitude and in frequency. And this slide is just trying to elucidate that. So what you're seeing on the left-hand side is just that the flood height associated with a particular event, the same weather event in 2050 will result in a higher water elevation than that same weather event, same wind speeds, same storm surge and so on, would have achieved, let's say today. But it also increases the frequency. So what used to be a 1 in 10 year occurrence is suddenly now a 1 in every second year occurrence. So that's that increase in magnitude and frequency that you hear everybody speaking about. All right, so moving on to the guidance that CERC has been providing over the past couple of years. Again, quite a complicated looking graph, but we'll step through it. And what we said in 2019 was that we should be planning for around 20 inches by 2050. And we said that we'll review this on a decadal period unless there's a sort of step change in the science and we have reason to review it more frequently. And even though we said 20 inches by 2050, we should also make people aware that it could be as much as a meter by 2100. And those are the two horizontal red lines that have been drawn across this graph. So if I get my pointer here, half a meter or roughly 20 inches by 2050 and 1 meter by 2100. Now, where do these numbers come from? Let's take a closer look. What has been plotted on these axes, and again, we've got water level here, or sea level rise rather, on the vertical scale, and we've got the year on the horizontal scale. And what you've got here is 4 different curves. We've got a purple curve here, which is basically the highest sea level rise scenario, which is physically possible, or so we thought during the previous round of climate projections, which were done around 2013, 2014. And that's basically if all the ice in the world were to melt, that's currently locked up on lands, what would that do to sea level rise? So kind of unlikely, but it's represented on the graph just for context. The orange line is what we call the intermediate high scenario. Now what that corresponds to is the sort of middle of the road emission scenario. So emissions continue as business as usual. We're still using, internal combustion engines, we're still flying aircraft, we're still shipping across the oceans. And those emissions are creeping up slightly, but not radically, because maybe we make some progress with mitigation strategies and so on. So it's kind of a middle of the road emission scenario, but we also have accelerated ice melt. So you may have heard of the glaciers melting and pouring their water contents into the oceans. That's what we call the intermediate high scenario. The intermediate low scenario is the same emission scenario, so the same thing going on with vehicles and transport and power generation and so on, but we have less ice melt. And there are various, researched reasons for why they came up with the numbers. And then the blue is purely based on measurements. So we draw a line through the measurements that we have thus far, and then we extend that same line. We just extrapolate the line through to the end of the century. And that's where we get these 4 curves from. And the 20 inches by 2050 came about because Jim O'Donnell was looking at the upper bound of the intermediate low scenario and the lower bound of the intermediate high scenario. So it's basically this area of high confidence that whether we have this high sea level rise scenario or whether we have this low sea level rise scenario, this 20 inches by 2050 is in between those 2 curves, and therefore we have quite a high confidence that that is what is going to be the result. Right, so that was based on climate projections from about 10 years ago. And it's now come about that we have a new generation of climate projections called CMIP6. CMIP stands for the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, the sixth generation. And that's the set of climate projections that underpins the IPCC. You may have heard of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These are the model projections that underpin their work. And so that update rolled around, and we decided to review this 20 inches by 2050 and see whether there's convincing evidence to change it. So what you're looking at here is now a bit of a hybrid graph. Again, we have those measurement records in the different colored curves in this part of the graph that you've seen before from all the tide gauges around Long Island Sound. If we were just to continue the trend that we've seen in the measurements thus far, we would get this black line that we've extrapolated, yeah? And then what we've done in the blue shading here is the new and updated middle of the road scenario. It's now called SSP 245, and we don't really have time to go into the specifics of what it is, but it's kind of a business as usual middle of the road scenario. And then these red dashed lines here are really we have no appetite for climate change mitigation. We're just going to continue burning fossil fuels as fast as we can. We're going to prioritize economic growth. That's the scenario that you would end up with here. This gives you a cone of probability about what the sea level rise scenarios could be. Again, in feet on the right-hand side and in meters on the left-hand side. So what we see here is, as of 1995 to 2015, when this zero was determined, so you'll see here on the y-axis, zero is, we draw a line through this period here, 1995 to 2015. And if we look at 2025 so far, we've already had about half a foot of sea level rise, right? So clearly things are changing. But if we look at 2050, that half a meter or 20 inches is still well within both confidence bands of the middle of the road emission scenario and the extreme emission scenario. And so we're fairly confident that that estimate is still highly probable, and we don't see convincing evidence yet to revise that figure of 20 inches by 2050. Finally, I'll leave you with two case studies. So another thing that we do at Circa, and this is particularly where I'm involved, is we develop very, very high resolution, meaning very high fidelity. And the analogy here is think of an old pixelated photograph of an area versus a very, very, very fine, high fidelity photograph from your latest iPhone of an area. So we run these very high resolution hydrodynamic models, which simulates waves and winds and tides and storm surges for particular areas, and we see what the resulting flooding would be for a particular area. And what I'm going to show you here is just a project that we did down in Stamford. So you can see Shipman Point quite clearly here. The hurricane barrier that we heard about here is sitting in this area over here. And we ran various scenarios. They were all based on Hurricane Sandy, or Superstorm Sandy, but we simulated Sandy and the effect of the same storm with different sea level rise scenarios. So what you're going to see is an animation of flooding here. And in the top left-hand panel, you've got no sea level, so it is the present-day sea level. In the top right-hand panel, you've got 25 centimeters of sea level rise, so about 10 inches of sea level rise, and you'll see the difference of the flooding with that slight bit of sea level rise. Bottom left, you've got half a meter or 20 inches roughly of sea level rise. And in the bottom right, you've got 100 centimeters or 40 inches of sea level rise, which is something we could see by 2100, for example. So I'm going to run this simulation here, if I can. And it's just kind of a nice picture, but it's difficult to watch all four panels at the same time. But as the storm takes hold, you'll see that the higher the mean sea level, you can see marked differences in the level of flooding. The color scale is feet above ground over Stamford. Now, in this particular case, we left the hurricane barrier open, but we did also simulate it with the hurricane barrier closed. This was just to specifically check the impact of sea level rise. So if we look at a static version of what I just showed you, The colors this time represent the flooding that you can expect from a particular storm. So wherever it is blue, that's where you can expect flooding in a 1 in 10 year storm, or a 10% chance per year storm, right? Everywhere where it is green, you can expect to flood in a 1 in 50 year storm. Everywhere where it is purple, you can expect it to flood if it's a 1 in 100 year storm. And everywhere that is red will only flood during a 1 in 500 year storm. And this is the current scenario with no sea level rise, but the hurricane barrier open. If we then add 20 inches of sea level rise, a couple of things happen. Firstly, you can notice here that what was previously red, in other words, what would previously only flood once in 500 years, or a 1 in 500 chance per year of flooding, is suddenly now a 1 in 100 year, or 1 in 100 year, per year chance of flooding, right? So things are more likely to flood than they were with 0.5 meter or 20 inches of sea level rise. And if we extend that to 1 meter, what you can see is that almost everything is now blue, meaning that areas of the town that previously were likely to only flood once every 500 years are suddenly flooding once every 10 years, or a 50-fold increase in the likelihood of flooding purely because of this moderate increase in the mean sea level. So there I've just highlighted some areas which showed radical differences in the likelihood of flood extent based on sea level rise. Again, I must caveat here that the hurricane barrier is open, but this was just a nice clear example and was part of our scenario planning to see what would happen if the barrier had to be open for some reason. And this was another case that we did down in Mystic, Connecticut. Here the color scale is again flood height above ground in feet. So where you've got the dark blues is more than 5 feet of flooding, and the light sort of grays into white is less than a foot of flooding. And we've highlighted various areas of interest and critical infrastructure. And what you can see here is that with a a Superstorm Sandy type storm, but with 20 inches of sea level rise, you've got significant flooding, to a great extent into the downtown area and affecting a lot of critical infrastructure. And this was all based on very, very high fidelity or high resolution hydrodynamic modeling, where we're trying to take into account as many of the relevant processes and represent them as faithfully as possible. And we use products like the LiDAR that you heard about in the previous presentation to give us a very faithful representation of the elevation. So we draw on data from all over the show and then combine it using our modeling systems. So some concluding remarks. Clearly, sea levels are rising. We've seen this from climate projections, but we've also seen this very definitely from measurement records. So this is no longer confined to computer model conjecture or pure forecast. We have observed sea level rise around Connecticut. I've shown you that modest increases in the mean sea level can dramatically raise the flood frequency and depth. So yes, 20 inches is something to worry about and be concerned about, and even 10 inches, as I've shown you in some of the examples, can cause a marked difference to your flood risk. Currently, we don't have strong evidence to revise the projection of 20 inches by 2050 along the CT shoreline, but I just want to caveat that as a scientist by saying that, of course, these are dynamic figures. So if, for example, there's a change in emissions, or there's a particular intervention in terms of mitigation or adaptation strategies, somebody builds a hurricane barrier somewhere, then obviously those numbers may change. So it's important to continuously revisit these numbers and check that they're still relevant. Planning should integrate updated flood modeling with infrastructure investments. And again, we have a general picture of what's going to happen at a sort of regional synoptic level, but it is important to do hyperlocal, very sort of neighborhood scale planning as well. And finally, just our research group exists to provide support and develop hyperlocal simulations, and then suggest adaptation strategies or resilience strategies to assist in this process. So again, thank you very much to our hosts. Thank you for the opportunity, and that's all that I have for now.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Any questions for Mark DeVoe? Oh yes, we have one over here. Yeah. So Mark, The 20-inch rise
Yeah.
you're projecting by 2050, is that between now and 2050, or is that between, say, 2015 and 2050?
That's a great question, actually. I should have clarified that. So that is based on something called the National Tidal Datum Epoch, which gets updated from time to time. I think the latest update to that ended in 2015. So that would be relative to the sea level that you were accustomed to in the sort of early 2000s through 2015. Great question.
Yeah. Any other questions for Mark? Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Mark, for a great presentation. So, all right, we're going to wrap it up here. Director, did you want to say anything? Or okay. So, I'll do the wrap up. We thank you for attending. I'm going to send out copies of all these presentations. I like to say the more you talk about a disaster, the less likely it is to happen. So hopefully these workshops will keep the hurricanes away from us this year. But you will all receive a copy of all these presentations, and we'll put the Dams 101 presentation in there too tomorrow in your emails. Thank you very much for attending. Have a nice night. Yeah.